These were the kind of key points that basically we asked people to think about in this Birds of a Feather session. So some groups have actually created a slide, and they can come up here and show it. But others, I'm just going to invite to just talk maybe for 1 or 2 or 3 minutes to summarize very quickly. If there were any significant points of the discussion, if you feel there weren't any really significant points or significant findings, we don't really have to do kind of an official wrap-up up here. So with that, let's see, is there anyone from optimization and finance? Is there Alex or Paul? Is there someone that wants to do like a quick wrap-up?
Hi, I'm Tony Green from PIMCO, and there were a scattering of people there for the finance group. The most surprising thing was that random number generation was a huge topic, both for encryption, but also for, for integration in with FIPS certified devices and that sort of thing. And the provability of the quantum bits and all that stuff. So that was a much bigger topic than I expected. The other things are the obvious ones, like finding the efficient frontier and portfolio optimization and that sort of thing. So.
Okay. Could you maybe connect the dots on between random number generation? What specific application, where was it all for cryptography, for fraud and cryptography and other purposes, or was it for something?
Any financial transaction requires secure communications. So
okay.
When you're dealing with anything from credit card.
So it was security. Okay. Okay.
So today, those all use CNGs in there that.
Got it.
That are certified, but the big challenge that came out is that in order to get FIPS certified, you have to have a pseudo-random number generator. You can't have true random. So the only thing it gets used for is to generate the seed, which is kind of interesting. So there was a guy from that area who talked about the work that they're doing with FIPS to try to bridge that gap.
Okay.
That was it seemed like kind of a side topic, but then it turned out to be actually pretty core.
Interesting. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming up and sharing that. Let's see, what about quantum simulation for industry, materials, and chemistry? Rob, those are your slides. Okay, so we can move to those. And you wanna cover that, Rob? Yep, you can, go ahead. Here's the,
All right, so we had about, where are they now? Oh, can't see it.
Yeah, go back to the...
Is it behind me?
No, it's not.
I have to hook it up.
Yeah.
There we go. We had about 20 attendees. We had a broad mix of quantum algorithms researchers. I think we actually had too many of those maybe. Some applications researchers, and then a few business interests from the wider community there. We talked a lot about the applications that we were going to be looking at, and these ranged from drug design, catalysis design, especially surface chemistry was one that came up as something that hasn't had a lot of inroads towards having quantum algorithms yet for it. And then also nuclear fusion and neutron capture, which is maybe not chemistry, but is a very interesting topic that uses similar algorithms. One of the big findings that we had, which is why it's highlighted there, is that it was kind of hard to get an exact picture of what everybody was interested in as far as the applications. And this was generally true at this conference, we found, due to different non-disclosure interests and different companies that were involved there. But despite that, we did note that there was a very broad spirit of collaboration at this conference. And I want you to remember that when we go to the next slide, because that's where the biggest finding is. We looked at this and we realized that quantum simulation is moving more towards materials and away, or still retaining its strength in small molecules, but generally moving more towards materials. And the reason why it's always been molecules and not materials at this point is purely historical. It's just that the first people that got into this area were interested in molecules rather than surfaces. And we think a lot of the same algorithms can apply in both cases with some extensions. We looked at the different kinds of things you get out of a chemical simulation, and we realized that what you usually get are these curves. As you move the nuclei apart, you plot the energies, and you get these energy-based observables. And actually, for a lot of applications, that is all you need, actually, is to be able to find reaction barriers and look at catalysis and things like that. That would be sufficient. Though we realize that definitely for a lot of the applications we really want to do, drug design, photoactive materials, we need excited states, we need more sort of exotic observables that depend on more than just one level energy and that kind of thing. And that's where a lot of the algorithms research needs to pivot to in the next few years. And then finally, our big finding was that it was difficult to presently say what supremacy means in quantum chemistry. And the reason is we can surely, if we had a 300 qubit computer, run a molecule that has that needs all those resources. But it may be true that we could also simulate it classically for whatever property you're talking about. So we need to come up with new hard problems that really require a quantum computer to break them. And these often cited hard cases like Garnet Chan's famous FOMOCO are usually limited and historical. They're just the first things that the people that got into this area were proposing. And so one of the biggest findings is that maybe this should be not just in chemistry, but throughout the whole area, we should hold a best question competition, not a best answer competition, with a respectable prize to determine both a range of interesting questions and maybe one key one that is absolutely compelling for quantum computing deployment. And so we should find new ways to ask good questions rather than just trying to answer simple ones. That was our findings.
Great, great. Thanks for the wrap-up, Rob. Okay, yeah. Okay, so then we had quantum simulation for physics. I don't know if John, you want to come up? There you go. Thanks. Oh, so we can take this slide off. It's not relevant anymore, so it doesn't confuse people.
All right, we had a group that discussed several opportunities for learning about physics from quantum simulation. Well, let me just mention one thing. What has been a great challenge in physics for decades is understanding where gravity meets quantum, how space-time behaves when quantum effects are important. That's relevant to understanding, for example, what happens inside a black hole or in the very early history of the universe right after the Big Bang. And it would probably be difficult and also dangerous to do experiments with black holes in the laboratory. But it, I believe, will be feasible and very instructive to do simulations of those kinds of gravitational phenomena in the regime where quantum effects are important, and that those will be very instructive. Now, will we be able to do those things in the NISQ era? Well, probably not fully to our satisfaction, but we can take steps in that direction, which I think will provide guidance on how to do it better in the future. And we have a path on how to set up such simulations because of what the string theorists call ADS-CFT duality. We had a couple of experts in our group on that subject. And what it means is that if you want to understand quantum space-time, which can fluctuate and is very hard to understand with our current theoretical tools or classical simulations, there's a dual description of that gravitational physics in terms of a system that doesn't involve gravity at all and should, in principle, be possible to simulate. And there are two kinds of things you'd like to understand, as in other arenas of quantum simulation. There are static properties and dynamical properties. So in the case of static properties, one would like to look at the low energy states of the system, and they should have an interpretation in terms of geometry. And that geometry is encoded in the entanglement structure of the states. Entanglement is not such an easy thing to measure, but there are ways of doing it, and there have been some pioneering experiments to read out entanglement in quantum systems. And what we'd like to understand is what are the kinds of quantum systems that have something approximating a dual gravitational description. So looking at different Hamiltonians, looking at the low energy states and the nature of their entanglement, in some cases we may find that there's a kind of interesting geometry encoded in that entanglement. And the dynamical thing you might want to study is what happens when a black hole forms and evaporates, or when something drops into a black hole. Black holes are hyper-competitive. They have to be the very best at everything, and we think they are the fastest scramblers of information that nature allows, the most chaotic systems that exist in the universe. And one can see experimental signatures of that very rapid scrambling of information in simulations. So I think there have already been, well, there have already been some pioneering experiments studying these kinds of scrambling phenomena in few qubit systems. And as we scale up, I think we will probably find some surprising things and learn some lessons. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Thanks. So it does sound that there was some very interesting discussion in some of these, so I'm really happy for that. So the next one up, machine learning use cases for inference. Jordanis? Oh, there you are. Okay. You want me to hold that for you?
Yeah, I brought my cheat sheet. So I guess
I'll
these are all the
hold this
topics
for
that
you.
will be discussed.
Okay.
No. I think the main question was, can quantum computers and quantum machine learning in more particular deal with richer models? So this was the question that came up and up again. Can we enrich the models so that we can find better accuracy results and better kind of machine learning algorithms? The second thing that came up was, can we use machine learning, whether it's classical or quantum, to actually say something interesting about the hardware? For example, can we use machine learning techniques to understand better the noise models of the hardware so that we can understand better what type of fault tolerance we will need or what type of error correcting codes? So use machine learning as a way to understand the hardware and find ways to protect and make better hardware. So that was another question. In the healthcare business, they care about classification of molecular data. This is enormous amounts of data. So can quantum computers come up with better solutions? Batteries and materials, they appear also in the machine learning. Autonomous vehicles, computer vision, can we select hyperparameters for all these kind of problems? Can we search for hyperparameter regimes using quantum algorithms, for example, for searching? Can we start modeling and try to find this type of parameters using quantum algorithms? And the last, more NISQ-ish application was, can we use quantum Boltzmann machines for chemistry and find quantum analogs of DFT techniques that are used in chemistry in practice? So I think this was all.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, and we will probably summarize those. I have one other announcement to make about kind of all the material that has come together and all the content that has come together, and these key points actually will probably summarize them in some final deliverable. So the next one, ML use cases for training classical models. I know there was a lot of discussion back there. Nathan, you want to come up? Hey, you guys kept going even though we had started, so you must have been talking about something good. So.
What can I say? They can't shut me up. Yeah, I think that there was a bunch of interesting questions that ended up coming up. I mean, naturally, of course, one of the big ones is, right, what examples of interesting problems could we actually take a look at in nearish term hardware that are particularly for classical applications? So, there were some things that we ended up taking a look at. In particular, could quantum algorithms be used for boosting? It was one potential advantage that we could see. Boosting in a way that would end up giving advantage for near-term devices. Other questions that ended up coming up is, would it be possible, in order for us to actually demonstrate there's some sort of an advantage in terms of, either model richness or even just speed of classification, using D-Wave hardware in order to be able to build some form of a neural net classifier like a Boltzmann machine or other types of approaches? one of the challenges that we ended up coming up with about the question of whether or not these constitute NISQ applications is just, when we start taking a look at the types of hardware that we'd want to use here, what's considered, near-term intermediate scale for quantum annealers versus traditional quantum computing hardware like, transmons and the like, it's pretty stark, right? For quantum annealers, you might have poor quality couplers, and you don't have a universal set of gates, but you've got the ability to have thousands of qubits. So what's attainable in some metrics with some of these devices is totally unattainable in others. So coming up with a uniform answer to what we could do with NISQ era technology, I think kind of has to bifurcate over both of the different paths that we could potentially use in order to be able to attain this. So if we look at what we would need in order to be able to, say train a quantum neural network like a variational autoencoder or something like that using real near-term hardware, there's a couple of things that I think we need. We need to keep on making progress on our gate fidelities. If we've got 1-ish% errors that we're taking a look at it, then, if we've got any network that requires 100 gates or so, which you're going to probably need if you need 100 qubits in order to store your input data, then, we just really need to keep on making progress on that. Also, the other thing is that because of the constraints and the types of nonlinearities that you can end up imposing in quantum mechanics, we kind of also would like to have more qubits, because more qubits means you can get away with better nonlinearities. You can compute nonlinear functions in qubit strings, no problem, but if you have to do that in amplitudes, state distinguishability creates some issues. So we also need to have more qubits. Now, if we look at the discussion on the annealing side of the table, there's a couple of things that we need, and these form the same standard wish lists that I think everybody's been making for a while. We need better precision for the couplers, but perhaps arguably more importantly, looking at higher connectivity graphs would be really, really important for us being able to take realistic problems and embedding it in actual hardware. Then, of course, there was improving the couplers. But one of the things that I think stood out in a big way in terms of this is actually kind of a bit of an open question. And I think if somebody's got the energy and the right student to look at this, that would be awesome. And that question really is, can a compelling argument be made about the practicality or the impracticality of QRAM in realistic hardware, considering whether, and fully going into detail in a totally unambiguous way about whether QRAM is going to actually be possible in pre-fault tolerant hardware or whether it's not. And these discussions would silence a lot of the debate that exists right now in the community about whether or not exponential speedups that are reliant on QRAM are things we're going to see now, things we're going to see later, or things that we're going to see never. So those are sort of, I think, kind of the main things that we were mostly dancing around. But I think it's fair to say that with what we have right now at the moment, I don't think that there's a clear example of a NISQ era quantum machine learning advantage that we can show for classical data at the moment. But there's a lot of cool heuristics that we're able to play with at the moment. And just like we can't prove that classical neural networks are going to have better expressive power than, say, support vector machines, we might end up finding that some of our quantum heuristics perform much better than we'd think against some domain problems. So that's why I think it's important that we continue to explore the heuristics that we can do on a NISQ era level, but at the same time continue to push and have a better theoretical understanding of what we're likely to see in that space.
Thanks. Sounds like a very interesting discussion. Thanks. Okay, so we have two more on cryptography, quantum certified random number generators. I don't know if anyone from that group, I don't know if Scott or Bill or Matt want to cover it? Yeah. Oh, Scott is back there.
He volunteered me.
Yeah, I figured, yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. So we just finished up, so getting a summary is probably going to be a little difficult for me right now. I'm still going through a lot of the discussions. I think one of the things we learned was there is still a pretty significant disconnect between the theoretical world and the practical world on randomness and how it's used in the world, especially in cybersecurity. I think the good news is that we're talking at this point, so that's a promising development. As far as the subjects we talked about, we went through a lot of things about certification, and I think the takeaway from that was there's no such thing as a single person certifier, so it has to be an interactive proof of some sort, and because a point that came up a couple times is that there's not a single random number test in the world from any standards body that can't be beat by a 1 gigabit ROM at this point. So that's kind of a sobering thing to think about. But anyway, lots of work to be done. I think several other points that came up were, if you look at all the post-quantum crypto applications at this point, and at least on the horizon, they are highly dependent on good entropy. And there's a need for really good entropy that at this point is it's a hard thing to supply all the way down to the leaf nodes of the Internet of Things. And so there's just a lot of complexity and a lot of open discussion. So,
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, and we finally have quantum resistant cryptography. Ananth or Vlad? Okay. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Alan.
All right, so I actually had a slide that I shared. Companies like VMware, ARM, we also had a group that was selling post-quantum crypto. I have the name ISARA from Waterloo. And here was the big findings. The first finding was not all the industries are adopting, but several are, namely devices, healthcare, government, and banks. Those are the ones that had kind of like much more stringent security requirements. An interesting thing about governments, they were talking about the DoD, and the question was like, should they just have one key or two keys if you add post-quantum crypto? And one interesting thing that they said was, well, every key requires $35 per person, and when you're DoD, like the United States, and 4 million people, it starts adding up quite a bit. Another area that was discussed was standardized reasons is one of the biggest reasons why companies are not adopting. So it's actually the lack of standardization that's a problem. And I think what the group said is that the industry itself needs to be educated that post-quantum crypto is not rip and replace your existing crypto and putting a new one, but it should be layered on. So if you, for example, one example was in 2016, Google had an experiment with Google Chrome where whenever you visited the Play Store, it was actually at least a percentage of the traffic was being encrypted with post-quantum crypto. And the last point was the inflection point would likely be when the first logical qubit was demonstrated. Namely because, if you have one logical qubit, it pretty much gets rid of the science risk, and you would just need to scale out that one qubit to many qubits for the purposes of cracking encryption. So that was the 3 main points.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alan. Thanks.